What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Getting Fired on Your Way to Work. As always, I'm your host, Zach Cronin, and today we're going to be talking about Mike Brown being fired as head coach of the Sacramento Kings. Before we go ahead and get into all that, if at any point you find yourself enjoying this video, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, drop a comment as well. It really helps out with the algorithm, and if you do any of those three things, you will become my new favorite person. Now, let's go ahead and talk about it. The Kings fired Brown last week. One can only assume it was because of how severely they've underperformed to begin this season. At the time of this recording, they are just 14-19 and are fresh off of a 6-game losing streak. Had the Kings kept Mike Brown on, this would have been not just his worst performance as Kings head coach, but one of the worst performances in his head coaching career in terms of winning percentage. I'm not necessarily shocked by this decision. We know that head coaches have the shortest leash of anyone within an NBA organization. The second that you stop exceeding expectations, not only are you fired, but you're fired and scapegoated for all of the team's ills. Additionally, I don't really have an issue with this firing so long as the next step of the operation is to enter a rebuild and start listening to offers for De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis. With that being said, the way the organization went about firing Mike Brown is some of the most shameful shit I have ever seen. According to reports, Brown was notified of his firing over the phone on his way to board the team plane. The reports also say that this was Monty McNair's decision and he had backing from Vivek Ranadiv. Both of them should be ashamed of themselves. I understand the Kings had some issues on the court and Mike Brown wasn't totally faultless, but he deserved to be let go with some dignity. He completely altered the trajectory of this franchise, guiding them to the third seed in the Western Conference with a 58-34 record in his first season as head coach. This drastic improvement is noteworthy because Brown inherited a 30-win team who, up until that point, their most recent playoff appearance was a year before the release of the first iPhone. Upon ending that playoff drought, they nearly toppled the Golden State Warriors after helping push that series to go 7 games. For his efforts, Mike Brown was awarded his second Coach of the Year award, and that seems to be the tipping point. There's a graphic, there's a tweet floating around that pretty much once you win Coach of the Year, you're most likely to get fired shortly thereafter. And it's largely because the organization now has these otherworldly expectations of you where you seemingly have to win Coach of the Year every year to maintain job security. His second season with Sacramento was nearly identical to the first. He picked up 46 wins as head coach. Yes, the Kings dropped to ninth in the West, but it's because this conference was hyper competitive. Although the Kings didn't qualify for the postseason that second time around, Mike Brown implemented a winning culture and a serviceable game plan that for nearly 2 decades had been missing from what was arguably not just the worst organization in the NBA, but the worst in the four major sports. This year, however, their struggles are confounding because, and I'm going to put it very simply, the Kings should not be this bad. De'Aaron Fox is still electric, playing some of the best basketball of his career. The same is true of Domantas Sabonis. The Kings are one of the rare teams that are playing sub 500 basketball despite having two All NBA caliber players. DeMar DeRozan, who the team acquired this summer, is still a reliable contributor. He's averaging just shy of 21 points per game on about 49% shooting. Beyond him, the rotation has remained largely unchanged, with 80% of their minutes coming from returning players. This includes Keegan Murray, Malik Monk, Kevin Herter. All of them still maintain sizable spots in the rotation. I would argue that Mike Brown's biggest blunder as head coach was not finding more of a role for Keon Ellis. The 25-year-old burst into the lineup last season due to his tenacity on defense and pinpoint accuracy from the perimeter. On a per 36 minutes basis, Ellis averaged 3 combined blocks and steals while converting about 42% of his threes. This year, Ellis has cemented himself as not only an undeniably elite defender, but one of the best 3-and-D guys in the NBA. Sticking with that per 36 extrapolation, he's averaging 2.1 steals and 1.4 blocks while committing fewer fouls. Additionally, his three-point shot has improved, and now he's shooting just under 43% from the perimeter. Of the handful of stats I just mentioned, there's one that I didn't that really sticks out, and it's his minutes. He's averaging just 19.7, which is only 2.5 more than what he posted last season. Despite being more effective on a per minute basis, he's still stuck behind Trey Lyles and Kevin Huerter in the rotation. Further, he boasts the team's highest net rating among players averaging more than 15 minutes per game. He's currently at 8.7, which is 5.5 points per 100 possessions higher than second place Sabonis. It's just really silly not to allocate more points to Keon Ellis. Not only is he a productive player, but he's productive in all of the areas that the Kings needed. He is an extraordinary three-point shooter on a team that ranks just 24th in that metric. Additionally, the Kings aren't a particularly good defense, and Ellis projects to be an all defensive caliber player. Beyond blocks and steals, Ellis holds his opponents to about 34% shooting on the perimeter. The Kings, as a team, allow their opponents to shoot 38% from the perimeter. In situations like this, oftentimes it's hard to find minutes for younger players without pulling from players who need them. But I don't think that that would be particularly hard in this instance, especially considering that De'Aaron Fox is averaging more than 37 minutes per game, and both Keegan Murray and DeMar DeRozan are averaging above 35. Sabonis is averaging above 35 as well, but I used Fox, Murray, and DeRozan because they all play more or less the same position. But still, there are ways that you could find some more time for this guy. As great of a young talent as Ellis is, I'm not naive to the fact that simply playing him more would reverse all of the Kings' fortunes. This roster, as it stands, is simply not good enough to compete for a title. The supporting cast doesn't adequately complement Fox and Sabonis, who I believe are two guys capable of leading a contending team so long as the front office surrounds them with spacing and rim protection. This is a very weird season for Sacramento because they should not be this lackluster from the perimeter. Kevin Huerter and Keegan Murray are responsible for a large portion of their struggles from that area. Huerter has been a disaster. I think that's really the only way to describe it. He's a career 38% shooter who this year is shooting just 31%. I mean, if I'm going to call Kevin Huerter a disaster, I might as well call Keegan Murray a disaster as well because he's shooting below 29% from three. DeMar DeRozan this season is a more accurate three-point shooter than Keegan Murray. It's honestly surprising that Sacramento hasn't been impacted more negatively from their impotence. They still rank inside the top 10 in offensive efficiency, and it's largely because they're shooting about 56% on twos and 80% from the free throw line. Mike Brown wasn't naive to how Murray and Huerter were unplayable at times thus far. The five-man lineup with the most minutes logged is DeRozan, Fox, Sabonis, Murray, and Malik Monk. Malik Monk is simply just a better option on offense than Kevin Huerter is, and it doesn't come as a shock that this was the lineup most often used in the fourth quarter. That quintet actually has a positive net rating despite the losing record, but their defense is so ass that everything crumbles if they go cold offensively, which is likely to happen when one of those guys is still Keegan Murray. These problems are amplified against good teams versus whom Sacramento does not perform well. They've lost 14 of 20 contests against teams with winning records, and it's largely because they have the defensive capabilities to not only match up with Fox and Sabonis, but to suffocate the role players as well. The purpose of this example is to once again highlight the need for Keon Ellis in the rotation, but also to remind us that teams with championship aspirations need multiple Keon Ellises. In this specific instance with Sacramento, they would also need a serviceable backup center whose specialty is rim protection. Sabonis has never and will never be a quality rim protector, and I highly doubt that Alex Len is going to all of a sudden fill this void for them. Roster composition and team building are not and should not be the responsibility of the head coach. That falls under the jurisdiction of the front office, and Monty McNair simply did not do enough this most recent offseason to build an elite roster for Mike Brown. His most significant move this summer was bringing in DeMar DeRozan, but the team still needed help beyond him. I made a video on that trade in which I said that while this trade isn't necessarily a bad one, DeRozan doesn't fill the key holes for Sacramento, namely perimeter defense, floor spacing, or being a backup to Sabonis. Those problems still persist. I don't want to definitively say that this season is unsalvageable because I don't like to deal in absolutes, but it will take a significant effort from the front office as well as a little bit of luck that neither Fox nor Sabonis comes out and requests a trade. The one positive for Sacramento is that they own all of their first round picks from 2026 to 2031, but I don't know if it's worth the risk of sending one of those firsts to Brooklyn for Cam Johnson, for example, only if you plan on blowing up the roster a year later. If firing Mike Brown to the Sacramento Kings is the start of their rebuild, they should be listening to as many calls as possible for Fox and Sabonis. Those are the only two guys on their roster right now who will return a hefty haul. And considering how spectacularly they've played, they will certainly fetch not only quality young players, but a handful of draft picks as well. Sacramento is dangerously close to being stuck in basketball purgatory, similar to where the Chicago Bulls have been. They're too good to tank, but not good enough to contend. I think it would be better if they just blew it up, listened to those offers for pretty much everybody on the roster who isn't Keon Ellis. And if they're serious about it, they will do that. If not, they run the risk of returning to the Sacramento Kings of old. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out this video. Thank you guys so very much for coming to hang out with me today. As always, I will see y'all in the next one.